Hello, Mudasir. How are you?
Hi, Sai. I'm good. How are you today?
I'm doing all right. Thank you so much. It's always good to see you.
Likewise.
Thank
And
you.
good to meet here once again.
Most definitely. So, this is our third uh, conversation around deconstructed. And the topic for us today is theory of practice and practice of theory.
Hmm.
A little bit of background just for those that might be joining us that are new. We're definitely in the mode of exploring some of the complexities of the world based on, I'll say, our recent endeavors as the human condition is unfolded in 2020, et cetera, and the complexities. And you and I have been really focused on deconstructing those concepts that we encounter very pragmatically, and then really offering perspective and guidance from our own experience and learning from the community as well.
Right, right.
So would love for you to introduce yourself a little bit for those that might be new and joining us today, Mudasir, and I'll do the same.
Sure. Uh, Quick introduction. I am Mudassir, working as an agile practitioner. I work with organizations and teams, coach and mentor them to achieve their full potential and deliver the business outcomes. In that process, I'll work with across the levels from C level to the team members, as well as the teams located across the geographies. In a nutshell, that's my brief introduction, Sai.
Beautiful. Excellent. Thank you so much. And very, very briefly about me, I focus on transformation, working with organizations around their business models, their operating models, and really helping them calibrate to achieve the greatest impact that they can in the world. And Mudasir and I have different stories, different experiences that I think we'll definitely tap into.
Mhm,
So
mhm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sai.
you're
S-
most welcome.
Yeah, so before we talk about today's topic, let's recap what we have covered in previous two sessions, and then how does those topics will feed forward into this topic.
Excellent. Excellent. Should I offer sort of what I recollect, or would you
Yeah,
like to?
please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Excellent. Excellent. So from a critical thinking perspective, the essence to me boiled down to really being curious first and then creative, and being able to ask questions, look at from multiple dimensions, connect dots across perspectives, but really that curiosity first before creativity. And it takes a lot of discipline to do that.
Mhm, mhm.
Anything sort of from your that immediately comes up for you from a critical thinking perspective?
Critical thinking perspective is all about be creative, be curious, ask the questions, and then uh, understand the reason behind why the way is being worked upon or implemented. And there is no right or wrong. Understanding the reason behind it and figuring it out, is there any other better ways, and then that's a continuous loop of critical thinking.
Excellent. You are much more eloquent than I, my good friend. You brought in some key nuances, so thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Your kind side, thank you.
So, so relative to deliberate practice, if we switch and kind of sort of quickly recollect there, shall I sort of share what I kind of focus on? Excuse me, in deliberate practice.
Hmm.
So I think there's two sort of major pillars to think about in deliberate practice. One is definitely having a purposeful practice and fulfilling what we might believe is possible, and then really pushing ourselves, deliberately pushing ourselves to shaping what perhaps is an unfixed thought process or perspective. So kind of think about what you can accomplish. That would be more fixed in our minds, push to it, but then really pushing through to shape our future and go beyond it. And never, ever, respectfully, just naively practice, meaning just doing.
Correct, and well said. And then my approach to deliberate practice is make most out of whatever the skills that you have to have a greater impact in your area. And again, it's a circle of learn, unlearn, relearn, and expose yourselves, put yourselves in multiple contexts, multiple environments, and repeat. And that's the deliberate practice of same thing may help or may not help in one or the other environment. So in that process, that's where learn, unlearn, and relearn comes into picture.
Excellent. Excellent. So with that backdrop, should we dive into then the theory of practice and the practice of theory?
Yeah, let's
Perfect.
dive into that.
Perfect. So in diving into it, there's three words that you mentioned that I would love for us to start with, if that's all right, just kind of to dive into the topic. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, sure.
Perfect. So you mentioned questions, which are key to the theory of practice and the practice of theory. You mentioned exposing ourselves relative to different situations, different experiences. And then you emphasized the looping concept. So it's a continuous feedback, if you will. So, so in kind of listening to your description, I think those are very key words that really start to give us perspective on the theory of practice and the practice of theory. Any thoughts?
Go ahead. Finish your point, please.
So any thoughts relative to those sort of three, I'll say, anchor concepts?
Yeah, theory is easy to learn and practice is hard to master. So theory may feel one to confident that they are equipped to get to the floor and get that theory to practice, but it requires a lot of determination, hard work, focus in order to master it while you are practicing that. And then theory is kind of a direction where you need to navigate, and practice helps you how to navigate the entire journey. And that's the loop questioning and all that encompasses into what you just asked.
Excellent. Excellent. So the question that's on the table, and I think you're really emphasizing it in so many ways, it's an age-old question, right? The bridge between theory and practice. And it's
Right.
not one that it takes many different forms, I think, and we see it in different quotes historically. If we reflect on quotes, it's more relevant than ever, I think, just given the world that we find ourselves in.
Absolutely.
If I distill the question slightly further, or the topic slightly further, if we think about critical thinking is really the thinking aspect of it, like you're saying, and then the deliberate practice, the doing piece of it, what we're talking about today is that bridge between the two. And how do you strengthen that bridge? How do you navigate the bridge, if nothing else?
Absolutely. Totally.
So if I reflect on my experience, and I'm eager to learn from your experience, how have you helped perhaps others? How have I helped others? How have we helped ourselves? And how have we been helped by others to build that bridge?
Right. So to kick off this conversation of practice, theory of practice, and in practice of theory or theory in practice, I would like to quote the famous baseball player Yogi Berra's quote: "In theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, whereas in practice, there is a difference." So, with that said, Sai, please share and share your insights and thoughts on why why this practice and theory of practice and practice of theory is needed, and then what is it all about.
So focusing on the bridge, exactly. So the quote is very relevant, and there's other quotes we can definitely dip into and what have you. And the fundamental to me is that bridge. If you just practice without giving thought to how you're practicing, then essentially you're going to have to relearn everything. Relearning everything is not always feasible by any stretch, because there's so much to learn. So you have to have some degree of foundation. If you only talk theory, then essentially you may never have actually enough to take it into practice, let alone if you start to offer guidance for others. If you don't have practice, then it becomes all just theoretical, and really you're setting other people up for failure, for lack of better words. So So if I look at it in that way, there's many quotes that we can reference, and I'm glad you referenced, the one that you did. One stance that I take is if you just do theory, then it's not enough. If you do just practice, then it's not enough. If I add to that, the question that I think becomes very relevant is how critical are you about your practice when you're practicing? So, AKA critical practice.
Right.
And the next question that comes to my mind, and these are questions that we all pose to ourselves, we should pose to ourselves, how deliberate are you about your thinking? Coming to deliberate thinking at that point. So really intermingling the two concepts.
Correct.
So that's kind of my perspective on it. And then I've got many examples that I can dive into. But any questions or any thoughts just relative to kind of what I shared, perhaps in the perspective that I'm putting forward?
No, more or less, I am in the same page with respect to what you said. Why and then why do we need the theory and practice, as well as what means integrating these two means practice, theory, deliberate thinking, critical practice. Though we talked about critical thinking and deliberate practice, uh, I see why you are explicitly calling it out as deliberate thinking and critical practice. So to help our audience, can you elaborate more on why we went from critical thinking to critical practice, deliberate practice to deliberate thinking?
Most definitely. So if we take the thinking, I'll say, side of it, right, and really focus on the thinking side of it to start off. There's a few sort of questions that come to my mind. If you just think about it, and that's the critical thinking aspect. If you are not deliberately thinking, really, and going back to the word deliberate, if you're not only saying to yourself, hey, I have a perspective on the world, I have a theory of the world, how do I not only exercise that theory, that's the purposeful nature of it, but how do I deliberately now push beyond that theory? So one way to think about it as we build the bridge in one direction toward practice is, okay, I'm going to be in a new situation. I'm going to be in any situation. I can't know everything, so my theory can't be perfect. So now, what questions do I begin to ask myself relative to my theory in order to push it to learn new things? That requires being curious about a new situation, asking questions based on that situation, and then seeing where the theory really has gaps at that point. That's sort of one way. It just literally any situation you're in, ask yourself, what gaps are you recognizing in your theory based on the situation?
Correct. Yes, absolutely. And then while you're talking about this, the analogy that come to my head is theory is like a compass, and that gives us direction. Whereas while navigating that direction, what challenges you face, and that muscle is built up by practice, and then that's all about practice. How skillful, and maybe now we are getting into the how part. So in terms of bringing theory to the practice, awareness of theory, whatever little or more a person have, that is very, very essential. And then having that implemented in practice, and also implemented in different ways to learn multiple facets of how we are practicing what it has been learned in theory. At the same time, not necessarily, sometimes at times there might be a situation that theory might not help, so we may need to play with fundamentals, go with only fundamentals, but completely driven by the context or situation that is in hand.
Very well said. Very well said. The excuse me. Excuse me. The adage comes to mind that the map and the terrain are different. When I hear you talk, really, when I listen to you, it comes up for me. The map, if you will, is very different than the terrain. And
Right.
if you let the map limit your experience of the terrain, you can't navigate it.
True.
So,
Yeah, well summarized. That completes the full circle of what I'm thinking. Thank you.
you're most welcome. If we
And
Yeah,
Go
go
ahead.
on, please. No, no, please go
No,
ahead.
I was about to ask, go ahead and share some insights on how we can navigate on theory and practice.
So on the flip side of it, if you just
Mhm.
practice, right? If you just practice, but you're not critical of your practice, then fundamentally you don't reflect on your practice. And very explicitly, one of the techniques that I use is whatever I do, whether it's myself or whether it's with a team or what have you, whatever the experience is, as soon as that experience is over, I try to minimize the opportunity for reflection on the experience.
Mhm,
This
mhm,
and the way that and I'm very deliberate in how I actually engage that reflection. I don't come in and say, well, let's figure out what worked and what didn't work. Because notice,
mhm.
I've already polarized the conversation and I've
Correct.
limited it. But rather, what I say is, what did we experience in what we were doing? At that point, it opens up the question of, okay, what did we experience? Because now we can mine that to essentially really improve and be critical from our practice.
Yeah. This one thing, what you mentioned is a big game changer, and rather than simply asking what did we like or what did went well and what wasn't, and what is experience, what did the experience all of us went through, is a game changer, and it opens up all sorts of conversation, and in the process of reflection, we will have a lot of aha moments as well.
Exactly. Exactly. Anything sort of to add from your vantage point relative to going from practice to theory, Mudasir, and kind of what I've shared? Any other thoughts, if you will, to add on?
So sometimes I personally experience that thinking alone might not take you to far distance. So thinking also needs to be happen together in a group, or a couple of people or more than that. That way, it's essentially brainstorming, and we are brainstorming, and we will do that deliberate, and then we will bring that deliberateness in thinking, uh, in our thinking process, as well as now, when it comes to practice, it doesn't take right away. So we need to understand, we need to understand from the theory and thinking aspect, as well as when we do, as you rightly explained, the reflection part, the as soon as we do anything, we need to reflect what we learn from that experience and how we can improvise. That continuous learning and continuous exploration has to have open, and this need a lot of energy, and then this needs a lot of energy, and without that focus energy, and at times this process becomes frustrated as well, because you may or may not see the results immediately in the process of practicing while you are practicing, but once you persevere and then continue in that path, eventually the results will fall into place. So those are my views, as well as the guidance on how we can bring in the practice with help of theory.
Excellent. I, I really like that, and it resonates very much with my experience. There's three key things I think you're mentioning. One is having good partners, if you will,
Hmm.
relative to both. It takes work, it's energy,
Right.
and
Right.
then don't give up on it. Don't discount it, because it could take time until you see the results. Those are very key aspects. And one way, if I add on to it, one way that I'll say I've approached it from both sides is if I'm working with, if I'm doing something, if you will,
Hmm.
um, I will observe others very curiously.
Right.
So and creatively, and think about what questions do I have, and then I will have others observe me. But what's interesting is when they observe me, I don't ask them for feedback. You may say,
Hmm.
I actually ask them, what are they curious about?
Hmm. Hmm.
Because when they observe me and they tell me what they're curious about, they're essentially noticing something very crucial that I should potentially improve.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's a slight shift.
Hmm.
Let me add two other things, if you will, and then I'll pause.
Yeah.
The,
Hmm.
the other thing that I'll do is if I'm thinking about something, then, and this is the deliberate thinking piece of it, if I'm thinking about something, I will pause and actually say, okay, how do I challenge other people's thinking, or I will invite other people to challenge my thinking. And when I
Mm-hmm.
say challenge at that point, it's really, I ask the fundamental question, what's missing?
Right, right. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So it returns
So,
us to the questioning. Forgive me, Mudasir.
go ahead, please, please,
It
go ahead.
returns us to exactly where we had started about the questioning on both sides, if you will, and getting other people to question curiously and creatively versus just offer feedback, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, so that openness needs to be there, what's missing, and then people needs to be open enough to ask what are we missing here. And the partner, that's where the partner comes into picture. And if it is just a peer or co-worker or someone else other than partner, unless they are not considering as owner, they have their ownership in this process of thinking and practicing, then what's missing is something one cannot ask. Even if they ask, the other person doesn't feel the ownership. The other person might not also find the courage or conviction to tell what is missing.
Yeah, yeah. And as much as we talk about to your and to that point, that conviction especially, we can ask all sorts of questions, but if we do nothing with the answers, it's quite worthless.
Exactly. Hmm. Yeah.
So whether on the thinking part and the practice part, on both
Yeah.
parts.
Yeah. Practice without reflection is as good as a robotic routine.
Well said. Very well said. And thinking without practice, very much similarly.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Thinking, practice, and then yeah, and reflection. These three. And on that note, Sai, let's get into guidance, and then with your vast experience, and what is the guidance that you have to offer to me and the audience out there?
And likewise, my friend, as we're learning and exploring together. So we've mentioned some key things already, right? You know, what really pause and question yourself. That's been a key factor, and question yourself if you're going to toward practice or toward thinking. But that's
Mhm.
very, very key. That's one key one. And if I couple that with another one, have others question
Mhm.
ourselves, and question ourselves from a curiosity perspective, not feedback perspective, as I
Right.
mentioned, and
Mhm.
additionally, um, really look for the what's missing aspect of it in anything you do or anything you think.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and question from curiosity perspective versus feedback, that that's altogether different ball game there itself.
Yeah,
And how people will engage merely from the feedback perspective, and how people will engage from the curiosity standpoint is completely different. And you can easily figure that out. And is what you are getting in terms of reflection, or what are you missing from curiosity perspective as well as from feedback standpoint, it's drastic difference.
exactly, exactly. Can I offer some more if that's all right?
Yeah,
Almost just
please go ahead.
the uh, so essentially, whatever thinking you do, question yourself. Whatever practice you do, question yourself, as well as have others question you, etc. Um,
Hmm.
I've been very, very fortunate to have some incredible mentors throughout my life. To be very, very blunt about it, if you will, all the
Hmm.
way from my father and my mother, particularly, to Carl Page, who's the father of one of the Google founders, if you will,
Hmm. Hmm.
who was also a mentor ages ago. So
Right.
I've been impacted by people around these concepts without them even telling me about the concepts directly. And I want to
Mhm.
offer just, if you're okay, I want to offer just a few things that I experienced, that I try to foster.
Yeah, most certainly. Please go ahead.
So one of the things is is the element of paradox and surprise.
Hmm.
So a lot of my mentors, if you will, put paradoxes in front of me. You know, you got two
Hmm.
options, both of them are valid. What do you do with it? In a very real example.
Right.
Or, I'd be doing something and they surprise me with a whole different topic to see how I would respond to it, and
Hmm.
how I would actually engage in that topic in practice. So the paradox notion, the surprise notion is key. But these are the two very practical things that it manifests into. How many, a question that I've always been asked, how many books can you read simultaneously?
Okay.
So can you read 3 books? Can you read 4 books? And really what it boils down to is the context switching
Right.
between books. So forgive me for being a little bit long-winded here, Mudasir. We hear a lot today about, well, reduce the context switching.
Right.
I'm
Right.
actually a proponent of the opposite. Increase the context switching to build the muscle so that you can deal with a complex reality because it requires context switching.
Exactly. And yeah, on that point, forgive me if I'm interrupting. And context switching, limiting the context switching is not there in anyone's hand. And even in the product development, or when we are dealing with the systems and customers, events will happen, things will come up, and context switching is essential part of the product development and product life cycle. So yeah, and this understanding of building a muscle of context switching is essential, is needed for every professional, rather than let's avoid context switching and focus on one thing. That is a good practice, that is most certainly needed. And then uh, audience, or no one should think that we are encouraging context switching on the cost of productivity, or no, not at all. But context switching is as real as we need to breathe air. So I would go to that extent.
Well, very well said. It's being as productive as you need to be in a particular context. So context switch, and then additionally, by context switching, what I've encountered, people confuse context switching with focus. They think if you're context switching, you don't have focus. And the reality is no, it actually forces you to build your focus muscle, because when you context switch, you have to refocus, if you will. So it builds that muscle. But it's the productivity facet that has to be balanced, to your point, when you context switch. So
No one can control things how they come up. So context switching and how people need to operate or deal with context switching, that is a essential skill, in especially nowadays, we all need to learn and master.
exactly. So that was one thing that really, I'll say, my mentors very much conditioned me. And the way that it was conditioned is, well, how many books can you read simultaneously? Or how many activities can you engage in simultaneously? And that builds the context switching muscle. So I encourage, anyone listening to us, see how many you can do simultaneously. And especially children have a vast openness because they're far under conditioned, I'll say, socially, that they can do multiple things, and that will help them build that muscle. And that builds, again, the connection between theory and practice. Can I offer another one, if that's all right?
Yeah, please go on. Please go on.
So another big one, and this one is a very, very interesting one, and it applies again to both thinking as well as practice, is to do things backwards. Read a book backwards, chapter by chapter backwards, or take an activity, a practice, and step through it backwards after it's been done. And what that does is it conditions the mind and the behavior, quite honestly, to be able to, as I like to say, transcend time and space. Because now, wherever you find yourself, you can move forwards and backwards. A book read backwards is never the same as a book read forwards. And a practice viewed backwards is never the same as one executed forwards.
Yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's all I can add here. And then on a lighter note, it's like watching a movie from start to end, and then watching a movie, especially it has a series of it has multiple movies in a series. Then watching in a jumbled order, that gives completely different experience. Maybe it takes the suspense out of it, but yeah, altogether a different experience.
Definitely. And we actually see this technique in theater, in movies, if you will.
Right.
I'll say nowadays, where they show you a clip that's from the future up front, and then you don't know what it's about, and then you start to put the pieces of the puzzle together.
Right.
w- with my dear daughter, who's now in up, I'll say toward her 30s now, but when she was very young, I would actually, and at the time my wife would say, "Si, step away from the child at times," but I would actually show her cartoons in snippets. I'll show her a tail end of the snippet of the cartoon, and then I'll go back, if you will, reverse the it wasn't DVDs back then, but reverse the recording, and then show her another snippet, and then show her another snippet. And as she was doing that, I would ask her questions. What are you seeing? What are you thinking? What do you think is going to happen? Why do you think
Mm-hmm.
that happened? It gives the
Mm-hmm.
child a very different experience to critically think and also put those things into practice.
Yeah, yeah, indeed it is. And as you brought up about your daughter and an experience with her when she was young, so the theory and practice, one needs to truly figure out the difference of theory and practice. And if you have kids, especially in very engaged, you can teach them which is theory. And when kids end up doing that, they are bringing their practice perspective, and how can you as a partner help them to navigate. And that's
Exactly.
the correlation or analogy I could think of with kids and then parents.
Very well said. Very well said. I have one other sort of very practical sort of example I think it would behoove me to share, if that's all right, Mudasir.
Yeah, go on please.
So, so there was ages back, um, ages back. I did a lot more. I did some training and instruction, and I would deliver training and instruction. And I had clients that tell me, Sai, if we take these courses, right, or these training sessions, it would take us
Mm-hmm.
7 weeks. It would take us 8 weeks. Is there
Mm-hmm.
a better way to approach this? And the
Mm-hmm.
traditional way that we encounter training and content and what have you is you do the content, right? The instructor presents the content, they do exercises, then they do a review.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of the sort of a very simple pattern
Right.
if we generalize it.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would do is I would actually do the opposite. Here's what I mean by that. I
Mm-hmm.
would not do the content. What I would
Mm-hmm.
do is I would do a 15-minute overview, completely whiteboarded.
Mm-hmm.
This forces me to critically think. This forces me to take from my deliberate practice and be able to provide that overview in 15 minutes. Use
Mm-hmm.
none of the other content.
Mm-hmm.
Then I would actually, so it requires me to get to the essence. Then I would actually say, okay, let's go into an exercise. And people initially would be frustrated. Well, we don't know enough to do the exercise.
Right.
And I would say, that's all right. You do know
Mm-hmm.
enough, relying on your experience from outside the room.
Right.
They would do the exercise. And then after they do the exercise, we would review the results together, learn from what they've done. And then I would actually use the content as a summary. Literally, if it's 100 slides, then I could
Mm-hmm.
flip through the slides very quickly and just say, this is the summary, but they've already experienced it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Understand.
so to go from content, exercise, and review and reverse it to an overview, if you will, do the exercise and then summarize based on the
Mm-hmm.
content is a very different experience. And working with clients over the years, this goes ways back. You can take 8 weeks of what would be traditional training and do it in
Mm-hmm.
a matter of week. And you would get an improvement in thinking, you would get an improvement in doing. People
Right.
could, if you're targeting certification, people were able to get their certifications. But that's a
Mm-hmm.
very practical approach to it.
Right. Right. While you're giving giving or providing this input, what crosses my head is the exercising, whiteboarding, exercising, and then engaging is form of a practice. You are already practicing without knowing what it is, or you know something and you don't fully know that. And when as a partner, so not as a trainer, as a partner, when you force or put someone into a position of engagement, that is called a practice. And the content, the training material, what they don't know, or the impression or feeling of what they don't know or what they know, or the understanding of I know this or don't know this, it goes both ways, is more or less content, and which is a theory.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you, Sai, for that input. And yeah, engagement and exercise is practice, whereas content and the training material is, yeah, theory.
Yeah. So So if and I love what you just said, because you summarized really to me what ultimately I think the topic boils down to: theory of practice and practice of theory. It's awareness of thinking, it's awareness of practice, and it's awareness of the bridge. But it really boils down to that awareness. You have to be aware of both and then aware of the bridge between the two in both directions. And I think we all do a disservice to ourselves, quite honestly, if we only focus on one.
Right.
And we don't even focus on the bridge in both directions. But that's what I would encourage kind of our audience to take from some of the conversation here.
Absolutely. And then having more theory and less practice, or more practice and less theory, is not helpful, and it's not a right composition in navigating in reality, in the context what we face in day out. Having both in right proportion will definitely help us even accelerate our work, and bring bigger impact in what we're doing.
Well said. Well said. And I know we're coming up on our time, if you will, and what have you. I want to pose one question that I want to leave for the audience to entertain, independent of us ultimately, because this is also an age-old, I'll say, sub-question of the question around theory and practice, if that's all right.
Yeah, and then with that question, and then maybe if you have any other closing insights, we will give up and then wrap up the session.
Definitely, definitely. So this is an age-old topic. We definitely, you need both. The age-old question is, where do you start? Do you start in theory or do you start in practice? It goes to the training example that I mentioned, and it's a long aged question that I encourage our audience, if you will, or our listeners to think about.
Yeah, yeah, and there is no right or wrong answer, and it all depends on where you are at, on whichever the domain or expertise you are dealing with, and what kind of situations you deal in your day-to-day life.
Well, very well said. My good friend, anything else to add before we wrap up? And I apologize if I've over dominated the conversation.
No, no. So yeah, all your insights are very, very valuable, and definitely our audience will also find our conversation valuable. And yeah, we will continue to have these conversations in Deconstructed, and please look out for our invites.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Mudasir. Always a pleasure. Thanks to those who have joined us, and by all means, thanks to those who are listening to the recording. And as Mudasir and I always say, if you're interested in exploring a particular topic together, don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. And likewise, we'll have more sessions. So thank you, Mudasir, and thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sai. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.